People are very confused about lats and lat function. And today, what I'm going to use as a sort of teaching tool is a video that this guy, Elijah Mundy, made in response to a video that I made about this new viral exercise called the Keenan flap. And in doing so, I hope that this video is just purely educational and is not personal. By the way, Elijah, if you're watching this, I hugely appreciate the sort of respect and the non-personal nature with which you address this topic. And so I will try to uphold the same standard to you. If at times this seems personal, I promise it's not, but I will probably get a little passionate, get a little bit fired up. So I apologize for that in advance. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to basically lay out bit by bit every sort of reaction that I have to this video that he posted. And I want it to serve as, this video, I want it to serve as a source of education on the actual claims being made in the topics. But I also want you all to just take note of how much time and specificity it takes to address claims as I'm about to address them and disagree with them in a way that is actually comprehensive and makes sense and is understandable. Because on social media, when people go back and forth, there's very little space. Everything gets condensed and squished. And many of the things that people say and many of the things that Elijah will comment on in this video response that he made to me are totally incorrect in many instances, and in many instances are not just totally incorrect in the sense of like just slightly off. I mean like 180 degrees in the wrong direction incorrect. And so this is a format that I want to use to explain thoroughly why people are confused about this topic. So let's just jump right into it with sort of the first claims that he's going to make.
You know, at some point we have to let go of thinking that the skeleton and rubber bands can describe everything strength training.
Okay, so that's the first claim. And this is what I'm going to do in this video is I'm not going to let it play first. I'm just going to go bit by bit by bit because I don't want to miss anything. I don't want to avoid any claim being made. So the first claim that he makes is essentially that or really what he implies is that through using my skeleton, boop, there he is, Frank, say hello, which we'll use later, to explain things and correct things, ironically, the implication is that like, I'm trying to explain everything that could possibly explained with simply a skeleton and rubber bands. This is kind of like a trend that superficially seems like a counter argument, but actually isn't a counter argument. And in a sort of painful irony, not understanding things at the level of bones and bands is the number one thing that I think leads to most people's confusion about most things in exercise, among just understanding basic physics. And I think that much of the sort of counter arguments to this idea of me using a skeleton model and bands, I think it's most of it, just generally speaking, is a total non-argument. Like it's a non-argument to say you're wrong because skeleton and bands, the body is more complicated. It's like, okay, cool. I'm 100% on the same page. The body is more complicated than what I demonstrate with some rubber. But for practical purposes and understanding, I think it's an absolutely awesome model. And I don't, for practical purposes, see any sort of additional benefit in discussing nuances about physiology, because people who actually understand physiology, I think are deeply probably uncomfortable with people like Elijah and like other influences like him, talking about motor unit recruitment as if it's this very simple thing of like, oh, bigger muscle equals greater amount of contraction. And I don't want to straw man his argument or anything, so I won't go deeper down that path. But I just want to say as an overall point that this is not an actual counter argument. This is obfuscation. This is a distraction. And I actually think, to Elijah's credit, this was a smart way to start off this video. If his bias in this case is to disagree with me, right? A simple way for people who aren't really paying close attention to discredit my side of the argument is to suggest that I'm saying that this is as complicated as it actually is. Number one, which I'm not saying and I've never said. And number two, to suggest that it's way more complicated than this in actual practice, which it also isn't. So let's keep listening and let's get to the actual information.
First and foremost, let's get this out of the way. What action is actually going to be happening is downward rotation. This right here is just forced depression because you're trying to make a demonstration with rubber bands. We're really looking at downward rotation. There's the downward rotation right here. You need a better visual? Well, voila, because you can elevate and depress the scapula without elevating your upper arm.
Okay, so two major claims there. The first is that the action that we're talking about when we're doing some kind of pull-up motion, right? Because that's the visual that he showed. He showed a visual of me doing a pull-up, is downward rotation. Now, let's just be super sequential about this. The first thing, when we upward and downwardly rotate, there is a very, very close coupling of upward rotation and elevation. And again, ironically, if people were to actually understand the bands and the bones, they would know this just intuitively. But I want to show you all why this is the case beyond the thing I'm going to show you first here, which comes from one of the seminal textbooks on biomechanics called Joint Structure and Function. This is basically an 1,800-page freaking mammoth of a textbook. And this is the 6th edition I'm referencing. And so they're talking about elevation, depression, upward rotation, downward rotation. And I quote, "These scapulothoracic motions are often described as if they occur independently. However, the linkage of the scapula to the AC and SC joints, which I'll show you all on my model in a second, prevents scapulothoracic motions from occurring in isolation as true transitory motions." So what that's saying in simpler terms is you cannot upwardly rotate your scapula without elevating your scapula, okay? Here's another instance of that. Full upward rotation of the scapula is produced somewhat by elevation at the SC joint and more so by clavicular posterior rotation and upward rotation. So I'm not denying that those two things, upward rotation is a thing, but again, we see evidence that this is paired. Okay, here's a visual of what that actually looks like. And then also, just to sort of hammer this point home, scapulothoracic upward rotation would directly couple with the sternoclavicular joint, okay? Another one which basically says typical AC joint internal rotation, I won't go over that, whereas only 1/3 of clavicular elevation motion will translate into upward rotation. So you get the point, right? These are coupled motions, and what coupled motions means, in other words, is sternoclavicular elevation, right? Shrugging types of motions, which is characterized by the rise of the side of the clavicle, would result in upward rotation and vice versa. So let me show you all on my actual model, which again, in a painful irony, is going to make it super obvious to all of you why it's actually so important to understand and visualize these things. So scapula upward rotation, again, I'll just show this on the right side, looks like this, okay? So I want you all just to imagine for a second, you're doing a pull-up, your arms are getting pulled to the sky, okay? Does this make sense to any of you, right? If you were to raise your arm overhead, imagine your clavicle stays still. Does it make sense to you that your scapula would go like this without your clavicle going upward? Number one, that should make no sense because these two things, if you can see it, are directly connected. They're tied together very, very tightly. There's very little joint rotation that occurs at this space right here. There's a little bit of spinning, right? But despite the spinning, which is how upward rotation occurs, these two things need to move up together, okay? So when we raise our arm upward and overhead, okay, and we go boop, 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 right? This is what occurs. So you all see how this, I'll show it from this angle, this collarbone, it is moving backward like this. That's what that posterior rotation refers to. And it is moving upward like that, okay? And so when you raise the arm up overhead, and specifically when you're doing pull down motions, even if you forgot about all of those things that we just talked about, what is the load doing to your arm? Just forget about anything. You don't need to be that technical about it. Well, the load is doing this, okay? So even if there isn't motion, again, this is not the case, but even if we were to super strengthen the opposite side of the argument, imagine there was no elevation whatsoever, right? There would still be an elevating force, okay? So there are multiple components to this. One is just understanding what the fuck is going on in the body. And the second is understanding what externally is happening to you, okay? So the load, regardless of whether this is upward or downward rotating at all, is pulling upward like this, okay? And so this will sort of move us into our second portion of this counter argument that I'm making here against all these claims that I think are totally backwards. And by the way, hopefully that just makes sense intuitively. All I'm saying is basically that clavicle and scapula motion, they are paired, which should be obvious to any of you who have studied anatomy at all. And in addition to that, even if they weren't paired, again, in the strongest, most fake version of the other side of the argument, even if there were no elevation and depression, right, you would still be dealing with a depression-based force that would most activate the lats. So let's move on to the next part of this dude's claim.
All right, so we're really looking at upward rotation and the downward rotation. So again, we can't use rubber bands to describe everything.
Okay, again, so we can't use rubber bands to describe everything. There's another sort of injection of a claim that sounds like it's a counter argument, but again, it is not, as the claim that sort of obfuscates and doesn't actually address the argument, which again is something that a lot of people are saying and using as if it is an argument and a counterpoint, but again, it is not. And by the way, you will not find information that disagrees at least meaningfully with the specific amounts of paired motions there. So this is not like a point of contention in the anatomy industry, if you want to call it that. All right, so here's now where we start to talk a little bit more about muscles, which is where I actually think it gets better.
If you still try to defend depression, the lats aren't even primary depressors. You have the serratus anterior and the lower traps. So even if you wanted to say, oh, well, the lats contribute to depression, well, so do the pecs, pec minor and major.
Okay, so basically what he's saying is that even if, okay, so he's giving me this side of the argument, which is like, all right, let's just throw you a bone, bro, and let's just imagine that the lats depress, right? Which they do. And by the way, we can look at models like OpenSim models, for example, that actually show, yes, the lats do act and depress and have a moment for shoulder depression on the shoulder girdle, but there is direct EMG evidence that the lat, and specifically its lower fibers, the ones that run more vertically, they actively contribute to shoulder depression. And this has been shown in multiple studies, one of which is the Park study from 2014, which hilariously is the study that most people use to make the counter argument to this, which I don't quite understand. But this is true in EMG data. This is true in modeling data. And we even see that in this study called differential activation of parts of the lats with various isometric shoulder exercises done in 2013. We see that the conclusion was basically that the lateral component indeed does contribute to shoulder depression. So shoulder extension adduction, yes, the lats do those too, but to say that the lats do not depress the shoulder is a pseudoscientific argument. It's almost an anti-science argument, because all the data that we do have on the lats suggests that either through EMG or some kind of OpenSim modeling, which again, these are very advanced models that come from people who are way smarter than I am and who understand this stuff way better than I do, from institutions like Stanford, I believe the OpenSim model is from. Okay, so that's sort of some of the mumbo jumbo that goes into debunking the lats don't shoulder depress, which has never made any sense to me. And again, anyone could understand this if they just looked at this skeleton model here and you were like, oh, well, here's this big fiber of your lower lats. Might it make sense that if it pulls on this bone right here, that because this bone and this bone are all attached to this one, that this muscle would be able to depress? Oh, yes, it's fairly intuitive when you just look at it from a basic physics perspective. But then Elijah goes on to basically say something totally crazy here.
If you still try to defend depression, the lats aren't even primary depressors. You have the serratus anterior and the lower traps. So even if you wanted to say, oh, well, the lats contribute to depression, well, so do the pecs, pec minor and major.
Which is that the serratus anterior and the lower traps are shoulder depressors. Now here's the thing. Parts of the muscles that he just described have shoulder depression moments, meaning that if you isolate certain fibers, like you're looking at a dead guy, and you pull on them, yes, what will occur in some instances, especially with the lower trap, because the lower trap kind of runs like this, is shoulder depression, okay? But let's actually understand the function of the serratus and the lower traps. All right, so the serratus anterior is a muscle that sits underneath of the scapula, and it's kind of like this big banana-like muscle that looks kind of like this. It wraps around the side of the rib cage, again, like fingers or bananas, and what it will do is it will create upward rotation, okay? So what are we doing in a pull down? Are we creating upward rotation in a pull down? Are we creating upward rotation in that Keenan flap exercise? No, we are not creating upward rotation. We are creating downward rotation. In fact, this is literally an exact counter argument to the point that he just makes. He says, no, all that's occurring in this motion is downward rotation. And if we wanted to take the depression argument seriously, we would say that serratus anterior and lower traps are primary depressors, right? But does that make sense if you just say, okay, well, this is a downward rotation exercise, but now what I'm going to list as depressors are upward rotators? No, that makes no sense, right? The only muscle that would be able to depress and downwardly rotate simultaneously is this guy right here, okay? So let's just that's a major point to this, and a huge point of confusion, because if you think about, okay, what does serratus do? Serratus will upwardly rotate, okay? In an exercise where you're pulling down or where you're pulling in, if you are downwardly rotating, creating that is the literal opposite joint action that that muscle creates. If you wanted to say lower trap, you would if you looked at a dead guy and you're like, oh, here is how the lower trap orients, you would just be like, monkey see, monkey do. I'm just, there's a direction that way without considering the joint rotation forces that it creates on this bone. And the lower trap, specifically when it pulls in this downward direction, it has a slight depression moment, right, which has to be paired with other muscles on that will basically counter the upward rotation. But what this essentially means is that when the lower traps pull like this, they will upwardly rotate the shoulder blade, okay? So what Mundy just listed are two muscles that literally do the opposite thing, that are so far away from being involved in this exercise that anyone who understands the basic function of the serratus anterior and the lower traps will know that they are upward rotators. They are not downward rotators, okay? So those are the two muscles he lists first, and then he goes on to list the pec major and the pec minor as muscles that also depress. Now, if you saw my recent video on the Keenan flap, you'll know that I did mention the lower pecs can adduct and also depress the humerus. That is true. And if we are talking about pec major as a depressor, well, then we're admitting to the fact that like a muscle that attaches to this bone can actually pull this thing down. So again, he's making another argument that is actually counter to his first argument, which is that the lower pecs, yeah, they adduct, but they also depress. Well, it's like, okay, if these muscles depress, then obviously the lats, which are basically the counterparts of the pecs on the backside of the body, they can also pull the shoulder girdle downward toward the floor, okay? So hopefully all that is clear. The last muscle he listed was this pec minor, which attaches from this coracoid process and runs basically in this direction. However, in the context of a pull down, right, the lower pecs will have some degree of leverage out of the top, and they'll be able to sort of synergistically depress along with the lats that are running here. But what will happen with the pec minor is the pec minor will actually pull the shoulder girdle forward because it's in front of the body. And the lower pecs will also pull the shoulder girdle forward. So if you are doing an exercise where your arm is being pulled in this direction forward and you are moving everything backward, yes, the lower pecs and the pec minor initially may have some leverage to say start to depress, but because both of those things are on the front side of the body, they're actually pulling in the wrong direction relative to the resistance. So the resistance is up and slightly forward, or even if you say, okay, make the argument up and overhead, right, you are still creating extension and adduction with your arms going at least in a slightly backward direction. So even if you wanted to, again, throw all the bones in favor of the other argument, you would still be listing muscles, number one, like the serratus, that upwardly rotate, the opposite joint action we're creating, like the lower trap, the opposite joint action we're creating, again, upward rotation, and like the two pecs that were listed, muscles that, yes, may have some contribution to depression, but not in the force context that we actually care about and now that we're actually looking at in this exercise. All right, so moving on to the next claims here.
We still can't act like downward rotation is anything significant when we have the force of gravity working for us.
Okay, so this was a point that was honestly confusing to me because he says downward rotation is basically nothing in this exercise context because we have the force of gravity working with us.
We still can't act like downward rotation is anything significant when we have the force of gravity working for us.
I think that he meant depression, so I'll give him the benefit of the doubt there. I think he meant to say shoulder depression is not super important or not relevant in the context of this exercise. And the quote that he uses from this paper, which I believe is just a generalized paper on function of the lats, is downward rotation is accomplished by the force of gravity as well as the latissimus dorsi. So in this context, what they are referring to is an unweighted, unloaded situation wherein gravity, which is pulling us down toward the center of the earth, can downwardly rotate the shoulder blade, right? So if you're a human being and you're standing like this, right, does the downward force of gravity via your arm pulling on here, if I put my... So if you have the weight of your arm pulling like this, okay, the weight of gravity, the weight of your arm will, yes, it will pull the scapula downward with the arm, which again, ironically, is a counterpoint to this whole silly conversation about the lats not depressing or downwardly rotating, right, which they do both of, because they attach to this bone. And now we're saying, okay, well, if this bone is weighing this bone down, now it will downwardly rotate. So this is a really crazy point to make in this context because it's like, okay, now we're going to talk about the downward force of gravity in a context of an exercise where we're doing pull-ups. Like I weigh close to 200 pounds. Do you think like the downward force of gravity weighing my arm down is offsetting the still downward force of gravity that I'm actually leveraging to use my body weight to pull my arms upward, right? So the downward force of gravity in the context of a pull-up is doing the opposite. the opposite of what it is doing when you're in a standing position. So this is how confusing it can be for people to flash studies on screens like this, highlight specific portions out of no context that makes sense, right? If you hang from a bar, if you do a pull-up, even if you do the freaking Keenan flap, right, there is an elevation depression portion of that because your arms are being pulled upward in some direction. So the whole point of this is to say that when we do exercises to train our lats, we utilize the force of gravity such that the force of gravity is pulling our arms upward. We're not walking around in the gym, standing like normal people, training, shoulder elevation and depression, just going like this. Okay, so that context makes absolutely no sense. I'm actually a little surprised that this was a point that was being made at all, just to refer to the force of gravity as if it was contextually relevant. Because again, gravity in this case, if we want to describe it as gravity, is the pull-up bar pulling up on our arms. It's the pull-down bar pulling up on our arms. It's the Keenan flap thing pulling up on our arms. All those things are true. So anyway, let's move on from that because that was crazy.
We have an agenda where, we're talking about lats and the teres major, but there's other things contributing overall to all these functions.
So I agree that other things contribute overall to all these functions, which is why I just listed out and described all those different functions of all the muscles that he listed, and why in a contextual sense that it makes no sense to talk about those muscles, right? To train the muscles that he listed, you would literally want to be doing opposite motions, in the sense that, like, if you're doing a pull down to train your lats, you would want to do something like a raise or an overhead press to train your lower traps, because your lower traps are an upward rotator. In certain contexts, can they depress? Yes, but you basically have to fix other things. You have to not be performing downward rotation actively for that to happen. So again, in my other video where I addressed yesterday the Keenan flap directly, I went over all this. If you want to check that out after this video, maybe I should have told you all to check it out before this video, but anyway, moving on.
Because even with moving the upper arm, the pecs do adduction. So why don't we have anything on the pecs? So when looking at the given task of the Keenan flaps, like we're at 90 to 60 degrees, the lats are really great. Teres major is going to be great, but the thing is, the teres major is a synergist to all the lat functions. So there's nobody in their right mind that understands motor unit recruitment can sit there and say that teres major is a prime mover.
So again, this sort of vague motor unit recruitment comes up. I'm sure like actual people who are physiologists are kind of cringing if they're watching this, just because like I don't claim to understand physiology, and I think that most people who are talking about this stuff about motor unit recruitment just understand a tiny fraction of it and Dunning-Kruger themselves into using that phrase all the time on social media. So I stay away from the concept of motor unit recruitment because I haven't spent enough time understanding the physiology. But what I will say in this particular context around motor unit recruitment is that the argument in relation to it is mostly related to cross-sectional area and force production. And we don't actually have direct comparisons in real people, obviously, of like the size of a teres versus the size of a lats. But many people think that the lats from a physiological cross-sectional area perspective, which is just like basically all of the surface area plus the thickness, many people think that the lats are actually greater in physiological cross-sectional area, but this is not actually the case. And also that the force potential in terms of actual adduction and internal rotation via the humerus is actually greater. It's actually 20% greater from an isometric standpoint. Now, these cadaveric dissections were done on chimps because we haven't looked at this in humans yet. So to make any super strong claim, I think is a little bit silly, and I'm trying not to make too strong of a claim. But just based on the data that we do have, the model estimates, again, the force production potential to be 20% greater in an isometric context when we're talking about driving the humerus inward toward the body. And also, even though we are talking about a situation that is not relative to like live humans doing exercise, if you actually look at the size of people's teres, like this video that I'm going to share right here, look at the size of this dude's teres relative to lats. Like most people think that the lats are this really thick muscle. They're not. They're obviously a huge muscle and they become much thicker when you're a trained individual. But relative to the teres major, it's not like the teres major is small. And so to make the argument that simply the teres major is not a prime mover relative to the lats in this context is just solely based on this whole size concept and Henneman size principle, which is another thing that people throw around and probably don't understand. Myself included, I definitely don't understand it on a deep level. The teres major, super thick pillow-like muscle. If none of that makes sense to you and you're like, well, this is like so unrelated, non-contextual, I'm like, yeah, I would agree. This is the only data, unfortunately, that we do have. So what we have to sort of rely on in some ways is just like, what do people look like? Okay, so look at jacked people and look at how big their teres is and look at how thick it is from the side. Many people who are looking at a teres think it's like the higher portion of the lats. No, the teres is a huge, thick, awesome shoulder adduction muscle.
You know what? Let's try this example and show you why rubber bands makes absolutely no sense. This is a stiff leg deadlift. I would dare you to put rubber bands here and try to tell me that the glutes are the prime mover here.
So I don't know how this is a supporting, again, this is more obfuscation because these are non-contextual examples that are not really specifically described, but Mundy again says something like, you know, this is why the bands are stupid. You know, look at this movement. Are you going to tell me that like this is not a hamstrings movement? It's like, no, we're talking about very different things and very different conditions. And if you actually wanted to compare this to say a pull down, if you're referring to the concept of like stretch here and what will actually stop the motion at the bottom, what stops the motion at the top of a pull down is the lats, and what stops the motion at the top of a flap, a Keenan flap, is the teres major. So if you want to make the argument from the stretch perspective, from the band perspective, you know, this is a perfect argument in favor of mine.
Let's try this example. All regions of the pecs contribute to horizontal shoulder adduction. So that would mean the upper pecs and the lower pecs. But what would be the greatest contributor here? The sternal pecs or the upper pecs? Are we going to sit here and say the upper pecs are the prime mover here? Or are we going to sit here and say the lower pecs are the prime mover here? Absolutely not.
Yeah, so the reason that we would say in that context that the middle lower pecs are the prime movers of that exercise is specifically because of the fact that the leverages are very different, and most specifically because the lower half of the pecs are powerful shoulder protractors, okay? So when we are dealing with a protraction-retraction force, the middle and lower pecs actually have greater ability to resist something that is retraction-based from happening, meaning if your arm is being pushed backward, your middle and lower pecs are much better at pulling your arm forward from a backward position, assuming a sort of horizontal load direction. And guess what? If your arm were a bit higher and the angle were at more of an incline, your upper pecs would be the prime mover, even though you're still technically horizontally adducting. If you were to do an incline press like this, where your biceps are driving towards your chin, right, there's not a strong retraction moment for you to have to protract against, right? There is some degree of it, but not nearly as great as if you're doing a normal flat press. It's not because the upper pecs are so much smaller than the lower pecs, although they are smaller. It's because of the fact that the exercise setup makes it such that the upper pecs don't have to do as much work as the middle and lower pecs. So my whole perspective here is all this stuff, all this loading stuff and this muscle response stuff is based on the physics of the exercise that you're doing. It's not based on like how big is the muscle and what does it look like. It's like, what are the forces of the motion that you're creating, what joint actions are loaded, and what muscles create joint actions to sort of oppose the ones that are being forced on you in any given exercise. So just as a simple point of clarification, neither of these two examples, the stiff leg or the press, are counter arguments to what I made. And in my opinion, these are more sort of obfuscation tactics to sort of just serve as pseudo arguments that sound like real arguments to most normal people who will just sort of automatically be like, oh yes, that, you know, that makes sense. Middle pecs bigger than upper pecs, right? Or hamstrings, you know, in the context of a stiff leg. It's like, yeah, but none of that is a direct counter argument to specific claims that I've made. And none of that is a counter argument, by the way, to the utility and the use cases of using the rubber bands in the skeleton model. In fact, if you understood how to use the rubber bands in the skeleton model appropriately, and you understood joint actions appropriately and how muscles are actually loaded via torque at joints, none of this would be a point of confusion for most people.
How can we look at something like this when there's very little fibers compared to the lats and say, oh yes, the teres major would be the prime mover? Because if we took this same example and measured it with like pecs, you would not say, oh yes, the upper pecs is the prime mover for any kind of shoulder adduction movement. You wouldn't.
Yeah, so again, I won't repeat myself. Hopefully I answered to that claim already.
So you can't look at something like this and be like, oh, well, the lats are stretching more because you're elevating the scapula and then you got to depress or do downward rotate. Like, no, because none of those are significant. The entire goal here is to move the upper arm. The primary task is shoulder adduction, and the lats are really great at bringing that upper arm towards the body. They're really great at it. And so are other muscle groups as well. That's why the rubber bands make no sense.
So again, hopefully the rubber band obfuscation stuff is clear to you all if you are still watching at this point in the video. The only other thing that I wanted to say is that I do agree that the lats will be involved in this kind of Keenan flat movement. But funny enough, the people that actually feel their lats the most doing this exercise are not just moving their upper arm, they're actually moving their shoulder girdle upward as they move their upper arm upward, and downward as they move their upper arm downward, right? So rather than, hopefully this will make sense as a visual, rather than someone going like this to perform the Keenan flap where you just isolate the motion to your upper arm, the people that I've seen who are like, wow, this is a really good feeling lat exercise, instead of moving like this, what they're doing is this. Okay, so do you all see how I'm kind of like leaning into it and I'm also shrugging my shoulder? And honestly, I want you all to test this. Do the Keenan flap thing and just isolate motion of your upper arm. Just keep your upper arm totally still. Don't move your shoulder girdle. Don't shrug, don't unshrug. Do the Keenan flap that way, okay? And then do it again as you allow your upper arm to shrug, like do an active shrug on the way up and then anti-shrug to press your arm downward on the way down, and feel the difference between the variations. So this one was, this video was not for everyone. It was much more nitty gritty and obviously a lot in there, but we're over 30 minutes long here, at least in the recording. And I hope it's clear to you all my point earlier about sort of putting out all these tiny fires where people are making things like non-arguments, people are making claims that are literally 180 degrees in opposition to what the truth is. And yet if you're doing that in the context of an Instagram reel or YouTube short, it's very easy to sound like you're making good points, especially when people don't understand the basic function of certain muscles, a la laceratus anterior or lower traps, which are both upward rotators, which are literally antagonists in the context of the motions that we're talking about. So if any of you have super specific questions about any of this stuff, I'm happy to answer. Again, I'll repeat one last time. My claim is not that this is not a lat exercise. It's just not primarily a lat exercise, and that I would recommend doing pull downs and rows for the lats instead. So anyway, I hope this was useful to some of you. Maybe it just was all pedantry and it all is a waste of people's time. But if you're still watching at this point, probably not a waste of your time. And if any of you are still watching, check out the link below. I have a live mentorship that's starting in less than a month now, 60% off early bird pricing if you want to deep dive into these biomechanics concepts and you can understand all the things that I'm talking about at a fundamental level. So thanks everyone for watching.